Buenos días con todos y todas. Bienvenidos. Estamos en este momento en la presentación de resultados del proyecto gracias, análisis de los métodos y pedagogía, estrategias pedagógicas aplicadas en la enseñanza del inglés como idioma extranjero en el Centro de Idiomas de la Universidad Católica de Santiago de Guayaquil. Este proyecto está conformado por dos investigadores a cargo del director, el licenciado Gerald Hirsch, que en este momento no se encuentra con nosotros, pero está con nosotros el investigador, el licenciado Stuart Rivers. Stuart ha sido docente en nuestra universidad desde 1994 y junto con Gerald ha desarrollado 3 proyectos de investigación relacionados con este ámbito de la enseñanza del inglés. El primero enfocado más en los estudiantes y sus motivaciones o desmotivaciones, el segundo enfocado en los docentes y este tercero de alguna manera cierra el ciclo tomando los métodos y las estrategias que se utilizan en la enseñanza del inglés. Entonces, en este momento le vamos a dejar la palabra a Stuart para que presente los resultados del proyecto.
Thank you, Cecilia. Okay, before we start with any specific information, I want to take a look at this picture here. This is a picture generated by artificial intelligence, and obviously it's the picture of a classroom. But when we look at the picture, there are things that we notice that if we compare them with reality, genuine reality, are not always the same. Here we have a teacher who is standing, a teacher who is using audio visuals, a teacher who has a colorful, decorated classroom, and we have a group of students who are all enthusiastic and paying attention. This is what we want. This is not necessarily what we have in class every day. But as I said, this is an image that was generated by artificial intelligence, not reality. We'll come back to that idea in just a moment. As Cecilia said, the idea of the project was to analyze the methodology that's being used. With Gary, we did 2 projects where we analyzed the reasons for students to feel demotivated. Why are students unwilling or unable to learn languages? And then we also did a study with the teachers to find out what reasons cause demotivation amongst the teaching staff. And the curious thing was that we found that most importantly, teachers were demotivated by the students and students were demotivated by the teachers. There's a direct relation between the 2 actors in the whole program. So that needed to be understood more. So what we wanted to do was to understand the methodology. How are teachers teaching? Is that methodology appropriate for what the students need and what they want? 2 different things. And that was our original idea. And so that gave us the reason to start the project. And obviously, all projects start with a problem. Now, if we look at the idea of English teaching in Ecuador as a country, one of the most basic realities is that there are not enough English speakers in Ecuador for the number of jobs for English teachers. That's a basic fact, which means that the English teachers that do exist are going to be where they're better paid, where they have better conditions, better schedules, and genuinely a better life. So that's the first problem that we have. It's very difficult to get good teachers. Thank you. It's very difficult to get good teachers into all institutions. Now, as far as the Católica as a university is concerned, we've been very lucky. We've had a group of teachers who have worked in the institution for a very long time. The Catholic as a university, the Catholic as a university, is a university where teachers tend to stay. Teachers are happy here. Maybe life is not always perfect, but they're happy and people tend to stay. And that says a lot of positive things about the institution generally. But it's still an idea of who are the English teachers? Are they actually trained as English teachers? Did they graduate with undergraduate and postgraduate degrees? What is their experience? How long have they been teaching? And what is their experience learning the language before they even became teachers? So the idea was to find out what's actually going on in the classroom. Now, obviously, as a general objective, that's what we want to do. We want to find out how teachers are teaching and then to be able to compare that with the reality of what students want and what students need. Now, I said this before, what students want and what students need is not always the same thing. A little bit like when we're feeding our children at home. They want chocolate, we give them broccoli. Obviously, it's not always the same thing. So how do we convince our students to take what they need and be happy with it, motivated with it? It's quite a complicated situation. Now, as specific objectives, obviously this leads into the methodology, which I'll talk about in a moment. But the first thing we had to do was to get into the classroom. And there are several ways that we can get into the classroom. We can either do surveys to find out what's going on in the classroom, or we can physically go into the classrooms to see what's going on. Now, this is where the story becomes interesting. This project was originally proposed in 2019. And although 2019 is only 5 years ago, the world in 2019 was a very different place to what it would be just 6 months later. The project was approved, we were given the go-ahead, but we didn't start because as we were about to start the project, the pandemic started. And with the pandemic, obviously, all companies, all universities had to make very tough decisions. A lot of the time, it was a budget-based decision. Research was often suspended and then returned to at a later date. After the pandemic had passed, or the worst of the pandemic had passed, we were allowed to go back to the project. But we now had a project which had been created for a reality that no longer existed. Now, when we do research, we like to plan every detail. We have a calendar that we're going to follow. We have objectives for every month. We have reports that we're going to create, and everything is planned down to the last detail. But of course, the world is not a perfect place. And very often, even though you've planned, the reality can change enormously. So when we did start the project, our first new reality was that the classroom no longer existed. What had previously been a center of language learning with 100% face-to-face classes was now online, completely online with no face-to-face learning, which actually gave us a series of difficulties. How do you get into and observe in the same way that you would do with a physical classroom? So it made the experience quite interesting. Obviously, the surveys were also applied to the students. We wanted to identify learning styles. How do the students prefer to learn? Now, a little bit before we started our project, there was another project here in the university which analyzed student learning preferences. But the student learning preference research was done looking at specific faculties. And obviously with a faculty, there are certain generalizations that you can make. We would expect a student of architecture and design to be more creative than a student of economics or a student of medicine. We would expect a student of medicine to possibly be more practical than necessarily theory-based, as opposed to a student of law who should like reading, who should enjoy details, who should enjoy analysis and debate. So of course, although they are generalizations and there will be exceptions, what does that mean for an English classroom where we have students from all of the careers and all of the faculties? Obviously, we knew it was going to be a much more complex reality. But the objective here was clearly to find out how teachers were teaching, how students wanted and needed to learn, and to find the mix that worked, to find the parts where we could focus and control the quality of the education. Obviously, at the end of the project, the whole idea was to propose some kind of way of improving the teaching generally, to guarantee a better quality service from the university, which is what we are here to do. We are always here to permanently improve. We cannot stagnate, we cannot stay the same forever. Having said that, after we came into the online period, the next problem that we had as a research project was that the university took the decision to open a new academy and to close the language center where we were actually doing our studies. Now, this was a very unfortunate coincidence in time, because it meant that instead of being able to survey 300 students, we had 30 students. Instead of being able to talk to 25 teachers, we had 5 teachers. So obviously the scientific reliability of the results becomes a little bit more questionable when your market, when your universe, when your population is so drastically reduced. Okay, so the methodology was all about observing, surveying, and learning about the reality that we had. In the case of the online classes, as I said, you cannot observe in the same way. So we had to make decisions about whether the best way to observe was to connect to the online class at the same time as the students and observe just as a student would be doing, or whether it was better to ask the teacher to record a video of the class and then observe just with a video. Or a third option was to actually sit physically with the teacher while they were teaching the online class. And we consulted the teachers about this, and there was a bit of a mixed opinion, generally speaking. But what we ended doing was watching videos for most teachers. Remember that this is back during the times of the pandemic. Not everybody is confident with technology, and so we had to make a lot of flexible decisions in that time. I think the most important thing here is that we've got to get to the idea of our results. Where did we get to? We did the surveys, we did the observations, and what did we find? Well, originally, when we started the investigation, we said, okay, what is the methodology that exists? There are applied linguistic approaches, there are grammar-based approaches, there are student-centered theories. There's a whole mass of different methodologies that a language teacher can actually select from. But as we were about to produce our results, the world changed again. ChatGPT, probably the most famous example of artificial intelligence, suddenly became available for everybody. That includes teachers and students. And it has a direct impact on the way we learn a language. If we go back to 2019, when the project was originally approved, it would be logical to imagine a teacher that gives homework, a teacher that says, write an essay about, write a paragraph about, or write 10 sentences about, give them a topic, students go home, they do the homework, they bring it to class on the next occasion. What happens after the arrival of ChatGPT is that obviously students go to ChatGPT, they put in the instructions, they get the work back in perfect English, and there's not much that a teacher can do to control this. Now, one thing that we did know from observing the classes, and obviously from the transition to pre-pandemic to post-pandemic times, is that we have the ethical view of technology, what we want to control, what we want to prohibit. But then we have reality. If we go back to the picture that we saw at the beginning, there's a difference between what we would like and what we actually have. Before the pandemic, we had signs in our classrooms which said, "We prohibit the use of cell phones in our classrooms," which most people ignored, but the prohibition was there. During the pandemic, we all realized that we had to be connected, that we had to use our cell phones as the only way to guarantee a connection. So since the pandemic, we've accepted cell phones, we've accepted computers, we've accepted tablets as a very convenient part of the whole process of education. Now, the same is true with ChatGPT or any other version of software that we can use. We cannot prohibit this. We have to understand that the students and the teachers are going to use it, and we have to make sure it's used in the best and most ethical way possible. So that was our first idea here. Teaching style, learning style. We wanted to find how students were learning, how teachers were teaching, and find those connections. And just as we were getting to those results, everything changed again, which obviously changes our results completely. It didn't matter what teachers were doing right if it no longer applied to the new reality. Our second result was the concept of standardization. With technology and with modern education in general, there is this tendency to move towards standardization. We see this in all large universities and schools. We want to standardize the syllabi, standardize the teaching program, standardize the methodology, make sure everybody is doing exactly the same thing. But with standardization, there are two schools of thought. There are two ways to argue this. With standardization, you can guarantee, in theory, a certain level of quality and that everybody gets to the same level of quality, in theory. But again, if we go back to the picture at the beginning of today's presentation, we know that there's a difference between what we want and what we really have. So what actually happens with standardization is, if you can imagine that I want to evaluate two students with the same exam, and the exam is going to be to climb a tree. If one student is a monkey and the other student is a fish, that student is going to fail. But if I ask as an exam for the students to swim, the fish is going to pass and the monkey might well fail. With our human students, there are similar differences. We have students that are practical learners. We have students that are theoretical learners. We have students that like to work on their own. We have students that really enjoy online classes and others that don't. So any form of standardization causes victims. And that is actually very serious. So I think in education, although there is a valid place for standardization in international exams, for example, or in taking a driving test, obviously we need some form of standardization. I think in education, standardization is something we need to be incredibly careful about. So it takes us back to our original objective. Trying to find perfect methodology that will perfectly give the student what they want is not necessarily possible. It doesn't actually exist. It's a nice idea, but it doesn't necessarily exist. Let's come back to artificial intelligence. As artificial intelligence progresses, it changes every day. Every week there's a new app, there's new softwares, there's new functions. A year ago, we didn't have artificial intelligence on our cell phones in the same way. Now, through WhatsApp, we have artificial intelligence in our cell phones, not just on our computer. And that means that every student in class has access to artificial intelligence all of the time. But as I said, this is not something we can solve by prohibiting it. We have to learn how to incorporate this into our daily lives in education. So, as a conclusion, this project has been a complicated mixture of problems. We didn't start when we wanted to start. When we did start, we had a changed reality. We had online, not face-to-face, and everything changed. Today, we're finishing a project which was designed for an area of the institution that no longer exists. We now have an academy instead of a language center, which is a completely different ball game with a completely different methodology. It means that we would actually have to start the whole project again to understand today's reality. But I think this is the most important conclusion. In this world, in a time of pandemics, in a time of violence in the world and wars, in a time of drought or flood or no electricity, we have to plan for the unexpected. As teachers, we should not rely on technology. We should plan for something that might happen just in case. My advice has always been, and I think that this project actually shows this to be true, a good teacher needs to plan a class as though one student is blind, one student is deaf, and the rest of the class is hyperactive. If you can plan a class that will keep that group of people happy and do it with or without technology, then you will be doing a good job. Now, obviously, we had our recommendations. These were the initial recommendations that were purposely designed to help prepare the language center that no longer exists. But the reality of the recommendations is still valid. The idea was that we need to know what students actually need. We need to make sure that we are satisfying a need of some type. We need to make sure that our teachers are familiar with artificial intelligence. Teachers come in all shapes and sizes, all ages, and all levels of ability as far as technology is concerned. We still have teachers today in all areas who are not good with technology. And we need to help, but also understand those limitations. And we have others that are whiz kids with technology, and we need to exploit that dynamic as much as possible. We need to determine, we need to discover which tools of AI are actually the most appropriate for us as teachers, and for our students as language learners, and for students generally in the university. And then we have to try to integrate those tools into our lesson plans, or even use AI to actually create our lesson plans for us. We need to make sure that there is guidance and support for the technology. There is always going to be new apps and new software, and it's impossible to imagine that every teacher is always going to know the latest advances. So as an institution, we need to be able to say, okay, this has just been designed, this has just appeared, how can we make sure teachers know this, and make sure that our institutional training keeps as many teachers as possible completely up to date. But of course, perhaps the most important thing is we need to encourage critical thinking. Artificial intelligence is wonderful and brilliant and amazing and surprising, but it's not as good as a human brain. It's not as good as an intelligent, intellectual human being. So we need to make sure that both as teachers and of course as students, they use the artificial intelligence to help them work faster, to help them work efficiently, to help them learn better, but they should still understand that they are not producing reality. It is still artificial. And that basically was our project. Does anybody have any questions? Nancy. Con gusto repito lo que quieres en español.
La lámina de las recomendaciones anteriores.
Sí.
Como universidad nos interesa que todos los resultados de estas investigaciones se transfieran
Así es.
posible, en este caso a la docencia, a la academia, ¿verdad? Entonces, yo sí quisiera hacer una transferencia de estos resultados a todos los profesores. Vamos a tener que organizar desde el vicerrectorado, invitar a una reunión de todos los profesores de inglés, de las facultades, de la academia nueva, del centro no sé dónde, a todos. ¿Ya? Lo digo para que me hagan ese seguimiento. Y entonces, hacemos esa transferencia, pero también es verdad que yo puedo encontrar esas recomendaciones a lo mejor en un libro. Perdón.
Sí, es verdad.
¿Sí? Puedo encontrar tal cual no están ahí. Lo que sí quisiera que en ese momento de la transferencia se toque a tierra, identificar las necesidades de los estudiantes,